Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Matthew Silverman, the director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our lecture and conversation with Rabbi Lauren Tuchman, who will be exploring hatred, holiness, and the image of God. This exploration is especially meaningful as we approach significant times of reflection in our Jewish calendar, including Tisha B'Av this weekend, the month of Elul beginning in late August, followed by the high holidays in late September. We extend our gratitude to Andrew R. Ammerman for sponsoring our 2025 lectures. Andrew dedicates the learning and loving memory of Josephine and H. Max Ammerman and Stephen C. Ammerman. Sponsoring lectures is a meaningful way to honor or remember a loved one or to mark a significant occasion, such as a yard site, a personal or professional achievement, or a milestone celebration. Your sponsorship donations, as well as contributions at all levels, allow us to continue offering these lectures free of charge for all participants. Looking ahead, I invite you to join us again 1 week from today for our next free program with Professor Britt Tevis, who will be delving into the history of anti-Semitism in the United States through largely forgotten examples that expose its political and ideological roots. Professor Tevis brings compelling archival research and an insightful perspective that you won't want to miss. For more information on this program and how to get involved, please visit our website. As always, feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Kindly keep your questions concise and incomplete sentences. We will address them at the end of the lecture, though you can submit them at any time during the presentation. This lecture will be recorded and available on our website. And lastly, a link to the source sheet is going to be available in the chat. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Rabbi Lauren Tuchman is a sought-after speaker, spiritual leader, and educator. Ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2018, she is, as far as she is aware, the first blind woman in the world to enter the rabbinate. She provides consulting to individuals and organizations across the Jewish community on a variety of matters pertinent to disability access and inclusion. Rabbi Tuchman was named as one of Jewish Week's 36 Under 36 for her innovative leadership concerning inclusion of Jews with disabilities in all aspects of Jewish life. In 2017, she delivered an Eli talk entitled, "We Were All at Sinai, the Transformative Power of Inclusive Torah." And with that, I now welcome Rabbi Tuchman to join us. Welcome, Rabbi.
Thank you so much, Nat. Thank you so much to the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies. I'm really delighted to be with all of you this afternoon. So, as was mentioned in the very kind introduction, we are entering a period on the Jewish calendar that Rabbi Alan Lew of blessed memory really thinks about as the wider arc for the high holiday season. That in fact, the season of introspection and tshuva and return doesn't begin even with Elul. It actually begins with Tisha B'Av, when the walls fall down, when we are engaging in deep reflection and mourning. Tisha B'Av is one of those days that I think for many years, for a number of folks, has felt either very difficult to connect to, or it wasn't even on the radar because, of course, it's summer and people are on vacation and a bit more relaxed and, engaging in summertime pursuits. Not always really in the space of the deep moral reflection that Tisha B'Av invites us to engage with. On the one hand, it's a time when we reflect on the tragedies that we have experienced throughout history. But even as we do, there is a real danger in getting stuck there, in thinking about the past and only thinking about the destruction of the two temples in Jerusalem or the shattering of the tablets or all of the other terrible, terrible tragedies that the Jewish people have endured over the past 2,000 years. And sometimes that happens at the expense of thinking about where we are and the kind of reflection that we as individuals, as collectives, and as societies can engage in to build the kind of moral fiber and resilience that will get us through these tumultuous times in which we find ourselves. Jewish practice, though, provides us a lot of containers for thinking about how to do that work because it's very difficult work. And it also invites us and gives us ways and spiritual tools and practices for grappling with how we got to where we are, and who we want to be. It's very important, I think, from a Jewish perspective to remember that we are never stuck permanently in one place. Even and especially when we might feel that way, when we might feel such despair, perhaps, at where we are, that it can feel almost impossible to imagine a better tomorrow. But moving out of the place of sorrow and of rupture of Tisha B'Av and moving into the 7 weeks of comfort, moving us through Elul into Rosh Hashanah, really allows us this very long period of time to do that work every year. So I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about Tisha B'Av directly and then tying that into the topic of our time together, which is hatred, holiness, and the image of God. So one of the things that the rabbis invite us to engage with when they think about Tisha B'Av is that Tisha B'Av is an amalgamation in some ways. It's a time of reflection in other ways. And the rabbis, and I think what was a really incisive move, began to layer story upon story. So, what do I mean by layer story upon story? If one were to ask someone, why were the temples destroyed on Tisha B'Av? And particularly, why was the second temple destroyed? The oft repeated answer to that is the second temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, hatred without cause. If there had been no sinat chinam, if there had been no fracturing of the people, the temple would remain. The temple would not have been destroyed. The axis mundi, the center of the spiritual universe, the way that the Jewish people oriented ourselves in the world, the place of deepest holiness, the place where we could come most directly into contact with the divine, would remain had the people not engaged in acts of grave sinat chinam. Sinat chinam is, I think, a catch-all for talking about the ways in which human beings regularly forget or even choose not to remember the inherent sacredness and dignity in every single soul. And we do this in lots of ways, large and small. And we ourselves may have been um, recipients of that kind of treatment from others. And if that has been your experience, as it unfortunately has been mine, as recently as a week ago, it can be very, very difficult to grapple with how do human beings so quickly forget the sacredness and the inherent value in every single human being. Our tradition teaches, the Jewish tradition teaches, that every life is a universe. And the Mishnah and Sanhedrin, which I apologize is not on the source sheet, says that to save a life is to save the entire world, and to destroy a life is to destroy an entire world. And that though human beings, in the same Mishnah, the rabbis teach, human beings create coins and they stamp a seal on those coins, and that seal is the same. But that's not how the divine works. For the divine, every single one of us has that unique spark of divinity and holiness within that is sacrosanct. Yet, in the world that we experience it on so many levels, we as a species are not good at actually living this religious aspiration. We often say, and you'll hear in Jewish tradition and other traditions also hold this way, that human beings are created b'tselem Elohim in the image of God. And that means that we are partners in co-creating the world as it is. We are partners with the divine in creating and co-creating the world and our experiences therein. But I think often we actually don't connect our daily action in the world with that religious aspiration? What accounts for that mismatch? And what accounts for the rabbis choosing when thinking about Tisha B'Av to, as I like to describe it, layer story upon story? As a species, we tend to tell a lot of stories. Stories help us think about who we are. They help us place ourselves and orient ourselves in a often very chaotic world. And we're not often very good at being in Bamidbar, which of course we just left in the Torah reading cycle. We are not very good at being in the wilderness. We're not very good at being in that liminal place betwixt and between, not knowing what's going to come. It's really hard. It's sometimes deeply overwhelming. And so Tisha B'Av serves, on the one hand, as this container, if we choose to use it this way, for that kind of introspective reflection, which I think also has its parallel in Elul, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I think Tisha B'Av, in lots of ways, provides a container if we choose to orient that way. But also, Tisha B'Av can just reify past without engaging in the present. We can use the day as this day marks all these past tragedies, therefore, what relevance does it have for me? Without actually thinking about the fact that Tisha B'Av is also the understanding rabbinically, is the day on which Mashiach, the Messiah, however one believes or does not believe in an idea of a Messiah, will come into the world. The rabbis understand that Tisha B'Av is the day on which the Mashiach will be born, and they have a pretty classical theology around this notion of a Mashiach being a human being who will usher in this world of perfection in some ways, of just deep, deep repair. And so I think we can think about Tisha B'Av, to go back to this notion of layering story on story, as a day of asking a lot of questions, not seeking answers, but really engaging in deep introspection, or as our tradition calls it, cheshbon hanefesh. And so the rabbis taught, again, that the temple was destroyed, the second temple in particular, because of sinat chinam. And there's a very particular and classic story from the Babylonian Talmud from Gittin, which is on the source sheet. We're not going to look at that directly today, but I wanted you to have it as a reference point. The story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. And this often gets used as a paradigm for thinking about what it means when we humiliate, what it means when we deny the dignity of another person, and how that intrapersonal choice in this particular telling led to a wider destruction because of the ripple effect. So when we are faced with rupture that we don't understand and can't understand, story can help us find our way into some understanding. But even there's a danger, because sometimes when we tell stories about ourselves or about past events, we can create additional suffering for ourselves if we continue to perpetuate a narrative that ultimately doesn't serve us, right? And on the other side of that, we can create narratives that are actually very deeply self-serving and invite us not to face up to the reality of the rupture. So we can go in either direction. We can either completely bypass and avoid, which is a tendency that is very live in the human psyche, right? Because sometimes avoiding is far easier because facing what is too overwhelming. Or we can engage in such self-flagellation that ultimately we end up in the same place because we get so stuck in our own feelings of complete ineptitude and brokenness that we actually don't act. We don't act to build towards a better future. We don't act towards building towards a more dignified future. So I think the rabbis actually teach us a lot in how they have conceptualized and reconceptualized Tisha B'Av. The rabbis were compiling the Mishnah and the Talmud mere centuries after the destruction of the Second Temple. And I've been thinking a lot in recent months about what it was like for them to live through that period. Or no, because of course we are not able to put ourselves into that place historically. But I often can't help but wonder if, just as many of us are today, the rabbis were deeply trying to discern how they are, or they were who they were. And what did it mean for them? What did it mean for them to be in that place of trying to figure out what was Judaism going to be? Because the structures that kept it going crumbled. There was no temple. The entire devotional landscape of Jewish practice fundamentally had to reorient because the mechanism that allowed for it to be wasn't there. Yochanan ben Zakkai was one of the most famous sages who put forward in Yavne the ideas that became Rabbinic Judaism. There was a great brilliance there, and there was a great knowing, perhaps, that things were going to shift in profound ways, and that the tradition, if it were going to survive, was going to have to be able to meet that shift. It is also true, and I think it's important for us to name this, that this process of deconstruction and reconstruction happened over a 500-year plus period. We have the Talmud and the Mishnah today as tremendous works of literature that many of us learn religiously and some people engage with academically. And luckily, we live in a world in which Torah study is becoming far more pervasive and more voices are taking hold of Torah, which I think is an incredible thing for the Jewish tradition. But we have to remember that everything we have came to us over a 5 century period. And then ultimately, Rabbinic Judaism, as we practice it now, regardless of our own Jewish affiliation, Judaism is fundamentally rabbinic these days. That was not a given. It took a really long time for Rabbinic Judaism as the expression of Jewish tradition to become normative to the point where we assume that that's how things have always been. So there's a lot of comfort I take in recognizing the long arc of how human beings grapple with who we are, and where we want to go. And it really allows for us as individuals to do the deep moral reckoning, asking ourselves the question, who are we? Where are we? Where are we going? And how did we get to a place where kavod habriot, where human dignity is a value that we don't collectively uphold? That's going to be my suggestion. And that may feel really uncomfortable to hear. And I want to recognize that. And I think it's fairly clear in the world as it is right now that valuing human dignity is something that we unfortunately have forgotten how to do well. How do we get back to a place that Bereshit, the first book of the Torah, the first chapter of the first book of the Torah, invites us into, reminding us that we are all created B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God, that we have this inherent, irreplaceable dignity. And the beautiful thing about Torah, Torah doesn't start with our story. Our story begins in chapter 12, in Parashat Lech Lecha. The first two parshiyot of Torah are about humanity, fundamentally about humanity, and even more importantly than that, the first chapter in particular of the Torah situates us as human beings in this wider web of interconnected creation. So if we bear in mind that, in fact, our most sacred text spends the first 11 chapters in one way or another talking about humanity in broad ways and doing so without airbrushing, right? The Torah, one of the brilliant things I think about Torah, one of the things that I think is one of the most important spiritual inheritances of our tradition, is that Torah does not pretend we are not other than who we are as human beings. The Torah doesn't pretend that human beings are perfect. Torah doesn't argue that human beings are irreparably flawed and need of some kind of salvation, right? Because of that irreparable sense of flaw and an inability to extricate ourselves from that. Instead, we are invited to meet ourselves as we are and as we can be. And that's part of what it means to be created in the image of God, is the idea that we have the capacity within ourselves for incredible acts of altruism and incredible acts of love and beauty and care and tenderness. And we have within ourselves, unfortunately, as the rabbis call it, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, or it's often translated as an evil inclination. We could also maybe call it the negative inclination, to doing quite the opposite. So we are in choice, as the Musar tradition talks about. There's an idea of the Bechira point, which Bechira in Hebrew means to choose or the choice point. And Rav Eliyahu Dessler, who is a contemporary Musar thinker and teacher, teaches that actually many, many times a day, we have the opportunity to make choices about how we're going to show up in the world, and to make choices about who we want to be. And it's really hard to do that in this culture where information is coming at us faster than our brains and our bodies can metabolize, which is why there's now more and more people who are inviting us to slow down, not as a way of bypassing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on, not as a way of burying our head in the sand or pretending that we aren't living in very tumultuous times, but rather as a way of getting grounded in the reality of what is here and getting clear about how we can engage and respond with wise discernment and with skill. I think that Tisha B'Av is an opportunity to begin that process if we allow it to be, and if we orient ourselves to that, which I think is something that often is really hard to do because it's so overwhelming. And that's why our tradition is so passionate about doing this work in community, because you can't do it alone. Being with others virtually as we are, or in person, or even on the phone, or one-on-one conversations, whatever that is fundamental for us to be able to better, imagine better for ourselves and to imagine better for the world. And so another text that I want to just invite us into really briefly, I mentioned a bit ago that Kamsa and Bar Kamsa is a very common rabbinic Agadic tale told on Tisha B'Av or about Tisha B'Av. Now, Agadah, which might sound familiar from the word Haggadah, which of course is the booklet that we all read on Pesach, but Agadah is scholars for a long time had this notion that the rabbinic literature was divided into two broad literary categories, halacha and agadah. Actually, they're very much intermixed, but that having been said, an agadah tends to be more on the side of a rabbinic tale that often has a profound moral lesson. And in that spirit, I want to actually offer a different text that I think can teach us as much about what it means to think about Tisha B'Av in this broader way of reflection, which is the fourth text on the source sheet. You do not need to read along. I'm going to give it a quick summary of this text. So if you want to have the source sheet available to you, you can, or if you're listening later, you can always go back to it later. But I'll invite us to sort of imagine this tale. This is certainly one of my most important to this point passages in Talmud. It has been profound for me personally and spiritually. And I think that there are lots of different ways to teach this. And I have heard it and experienced it in different ways, I'm going to be offering it today as a lesson on Kavod HaBriot. And I want to invite that there is ambiguity in this text. We're not going to get into the specifics of the ambiguity. I think that's really rich fodder for discussion. And I would encourage, if this really speaks to you, to have that conversation with your communities after today's talk. But for our purposes, I'm just going to talk really briefly about the text, and I'll explain why I think it too is a dugma, or an example of the kind of work that we're being invited into on Tisha B'Av. So to contextualize, I'm bringing a text from Ta'anit, which is a tractate of the Talmud. It's found in a order or a seder called Moed, which really refers to holidays or appointed times. And this particular tractate is mostly on fasts. Now, the fourth chapter talks directly about Tisha B'Av and the 3 weeks. The third chapter, though, has a lot of really important texts about rabbinic behavior. There's a particular theological idea throughout the Masechet, throughout the Tractate of Ta'anit, which I'm sharing with you as means of framing, but I'm not suggesting that this is a theology that we should adopt today. But there was certainly an idea that when rain didn't fall, it was because of moral wrongdoing. So if we're thinking about situating this particular chapter or this particular Masechet of Talmud, we are, of course, thinking about the land of Israel. It is after Shmini Atzeret, so we are now praying for rain, and Heshvan has arrived and the rain has not fallen, which is a huge problem because if you don't have the rain, then you're not going to have the agricultural yield that you need. So the rabbis are trying to figure out why. What's going on? Could it be because of our own misdeeds? Which in some ways is really an easy way to understand why things arise as they do, but it also is incredibly simplistic and even possibly dangerous. That, though being said, it is also an opportunity for the rabbis to bring very self-critical texts about themselves. And I think that it's really honestly remarkable that we have inherited text with a lot of self-critique, because what it shows us is that it is possible to engage in that really difficult work and to still find a way forward. It doesn't have to mean the end. It just means an honest reckoning. So in this particular tale, you have Rav Elazar ben Shimon, and it's framed with this notion that you should be soft like a reed, and you should not be stiff like a cedar. In terms of your personal conduct, how you are in the world, and how you are in the world with other people. So now you have Rav Elazar ben Shimon, who it's important to note, and I want to thank my colleague and teacher, Rav Tali Adler, for teaching me this several years ago, that it's very important to note that Elazar ben Shimon is the son of Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish, as excuse me, I misspoke there. Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon is the son of Shimon bar Yochai. Excuse me. It's the son of Shimon bar Yochai, and Shimon bar Yochai is understood to be the author of the Zohar. You might have heard his name from that. That's a different conversation for a different moment. For our purposes, Shimon bar Yochai was someone who very famously in Masechet Shabbat in the Babylonian Talmud, there is a very famous parable of the cave. And Shimon bar Yochai and Elazar are in this cave together for 12 years, and they're up to their necks in sand, and they're trying to save their, garments, and they're doing all these things. They're in this cave together, and they're learning Torah all day, and they don't have many possessions at all. And they emerge from their cave and they find that people are engaging in the kind of pursuits that you need to do to live. And Shimon bar Yochai is incensed by this and is like, why are people not spending all of their days and nights in learning and devotion to the divine? Why are they engaging in this kind of, working mundanity? And the divine says in response, this is how you're going to treat my creations, Shimon bar Yochai. then it appears to me that you need a bit more time and personal reflection. So Shimon Bar Yochai has a bit of a reputation for arrogance in this particular narrative. And so you have his son now. And his son has been learning all day with his rabbi. That's really important to name this. He's been learning all day. He's learned all of this halacha, and he's riding home on his donkey, feeling very accomplished and feeling the way that a lot of us feel like, oh, look at all this stuff I've learned. I'm doing really well. That feeling of exhilaration or that sense of ego, and look at how great I am. He's riding home. He's riding on the bank of a river. So he's got this like nice ride home. I'm imagining this kind of tranquility. And while he's riding, he meets this man. And the Talmud unfortunately refers to this man as the ugly man. We don't have a name. And I think that's really important. We never know this man's name. And often the first thing that we lose when we are degraded or humiliated by another, we lose our names. So, holding that, the rabbi meets this individual who we don't know anything about his physical appearance, except for the fact that the physical appearance is upsetting in some way to Elazar ben Shimon. And Elazar ben Shimon says, or excuse me, the gentleman says, "Greetings to you, my rabbi." Now, I don't quite know how this gentleman knows that Elazar is a rabbi. Perhaps that's a literary device for later. I think it is. I think the rabbis are making a point here. And Elazar ben Shimon says, "Ugh, rake, empty, ugly. Are all the people of your city as ugly as you?" You might be thinking, what kind of response is that? But that a man who has supposedly spent his day learning Torah, who in the book of Proverbs we're told that all of Torah's paths are supposed to be paths of pleasantness and peace. The first thing he says to this man is, "Ugh, how ugly. Are all of the people of your city as ugly as you?" And then the gentleman, without missing a beat in my imagination, as I receive this text, says, "I don't know. Perhaps you should go and speak to the craftsman who created me and say, how ugly is the vessel you made?" Right? We're being reminded in the most beautifully stark and important way. I am part of creation too. I'm created b'tselem Elohim. I have kavod abriot. I have dignity that you don't get to strip away from me, Elazar. So Elazar, recognizing how badly he has sinned, gets down from his donkey, prostrates himself, and begging for this man's forgiveness, continues on his way homeward. And the man accompanies him along the road. As Elazar is begging for forgiveness, the man says again, "I will not forgive you until you go and talk to the craftsman who created me and say, how ugly is the vessel you made." I'm not going to forgive an insult like that. And I often think, what has this man endured? Because it's important to also remember that back in the time of the Talmud, any kind of bodily difference, anything, as my beloved teacher, Rabbi Dr. Julie Watts-Belso reminds us, anything that arose in the human body, like if you broke your arm, and this is an example I believe she uses, if you broke your arm, that was it. Your arm was probably never going to be set because there wasn't the kind of knowledge and technology around for that. So you had a broken arm. If your arm broke, that was it. You had a broken arm forever, presumably. So who knows what this man has endured for his lifetime? And it's understandable in some ways why he would say, sure, I'll forgive you if you go and talk to the craftsman who created me and say, how ugly is the vessel you made? Until you actually do that reckoning, there's nowhere to go, which gets us into a wider conversation about Elul. So the rabbi so Elazar and this gentleman, they get to Elazar's town. nondescript town. We don't quite know what it is. And in this text, at least, the townspeople come out in throngs. You can kind of imagine, my master. They're greeting him and they're thrilled to have him back. And the man goes, who are you calling my rabbi, my master, my master? And the townspeople are like, well, obviously Eleazar. And the man says, well, you know what he did to me on the way here? Do you want to know what this Gadol Ador, this Torah scholar of yours, did to me on the way? And so rather than taking that in, townspeople say to the man, oh, well, please forgive him because he's a great Torah scholar, right? So automatically, like, oh, but he's such a good scholar. How could he do something like that? He's a leader. How could he behave that way? And so in this particular tale, the man responds, I'll forgive him, but only on condition that there are not many like him. That the Jewish community does not become accustomed to behaving like him. So I'll forgive you, Elazar, as long as your means of being does not become customary amongst the Jewish people. And I think that this text, in some ways, is shocking. In some ways, maybe over the top for literary effect, but also in other ways is actually very honest. If you have been, as unfortunately many have, the recipient of degradation, and humiliation from another person, there's a reason that the rabbis teach that to humiliate someone in public is to shed their blood. And there's a reason that the rabbis teach that when we can protest the conduct of those around us, we must, because it's a way of thinking about our own moral fabric. And Tisha B'Av can invite that introspection, not only in terms of where we are, but where we're going, which is why it's part of that wider arc that I mentioned earlier. Tisha B'Av doesn't stand alone, right? It's not a singular day and then it ends and we go back to summer vacation and then it's Rosh Hashanah and we've got to get ready for Rosh Hashanah. Rather, Tisha B'Av is the beginning of the holiday season. We are now in the very early days of the holiday season that will carry us through Simchat Torah. And that moment of reflection that Tisha B'Av offers can then help us do the work in Elul, which can then allow us to enter the sacred days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And it's often true with lots of things in life that when we prepare, we tend to get more from the experience than if we just kind of arrive and hope the experience will happen. But what I'm suggesting for us, and we all have to find our own ways of doing this, is that these opportunities are embedded in the calendar. Ultimately, the choice is ours. Do we want to take them and how? And I think one of the deepest challenges of our time is that the tendencies that I described before of either being so overwhelmed that we ultimately get stuck in the overwhelm and then can't move forward because of the realities we live with, or that sense of I can't even grapple with the realities, so I'm just going to turn off and I'm going to find other ways to numb myself or to somehow unplug or whatever the thing is. It's really hard to know how to grapple. And it's not on any of us to do that alone, because as it says in Pirkei Avot, we're not obligated to complete the work. We're also not obligated, we are not permitted to desist. So we as a human species and we as a Jewish people and we as a community and all of the different identities that we hold, ours is not to complete or to fix or to repair all that needs repairing, but ours is to do what we can to create spaces that really lift up dignity as a core value and invite us to remember the holiness in every single human soul. And I would even go so far to say in every single living soul. And when we engage in that, the Torah reminds us that in the first chapter, in the first verse of chapter 19 of Leviticus, of Parashat Kedoshim, we are to be holy because Hashem is holy. That living and being in that kind of relationship is directly what it means to serve the Holy One, right? To live in a way that is emblematic of our highest and greatest Torah ideals. And when we fall into the places of hatred and polarization that are so omnipresent now, part of that is we have forgotten and sometimes are even incentivized to forget that sacred spark. We are very, very easily told, right, on a mass scale, and when I say we, I mean human beings, we are very easily told, like, how we should feel about other people. And when those messages are self-perpetuating through media and through the communities that we might be in, or through the people we spend our time with, we are deeply social beings who are very influenced by all of the sources and systems and structures around us. And it is immeasurably and immensely difficult for many to find our way in that space, which is why this on ramp from Tisha B'Av through Shmini Atzeret is so important. It is a 2.5 month period of the year where we can day by day slowly begin to do that work. There's an idea in Musar, in Jewish ethical refinement, that actually doing a cheshbon nefesh, a soul accounting, is a daily practice, and that during the month of Elul, we get the opportunity to go back and to review the year. However, we think about preparing, being able to do so with deliberation, with intention, with consistency, and with accountability for ourselves and our people and our community, it is so important. And our tradition and its wisdom gives us that ability. It is my prayer that we take that up in earnest. And I hope that that deeply ingrained wisdom that the Torah gives us, that the rabbis give us, that the tradition gives us, that has gotten us through 4,000 years, is going to continue to get us through the next 4,000 years, because this tradition has been through a lot and it will be present for so much more going forward. But we, as alive today and in this world and in this life, it is our opportunity now to take hold of that Torah and to be the links in the chain will get us through to a more abundant and resilient and co-creative future. So thank you all so much again for having me today. I'm going to pause here and I'm going to turn it over for some Q&A.
Thank you, Rabbi Tuchman, for such a meaningful and inspirational presentation. I welcome all of you now to send in questions to our Q&A using the Q&A button on your screen. So just a general question to get us started. You listed some different texts on your source sheet. Are there others, other texts or resources that you would like to offer the audience as we enter this season of reflection?
Yeah, absolutely. In addition, some of those texts that I know we didn't touch on directly, I wanted to offer, and particularly that opening poem that I mentioned, I had meant to mention. So thank you for the question, from Andrea Gibson, who passed away recently, is a reminder of who we ultimately can be, that we can be the kindest person in the world, and that every person who is born can be that. So I think with that, I would certainly recommend with what has now become a classic in parts of the Jewish world. Alan Liu, may his memory be a blessing, wrote a book called This is Real and You Are Completely Unprepared, which is where I got the arc from Tisha B'Av through the end of Simchat Torah from. He really addresses that in that text. And it's dated now. I think it came out in the early aughts, but it's a really wise and compassionate manual that can get us through this time. And I think also, in addition to that, book that I certainly would recommend would be Rabbi Dr. Julia Watts Belser's Loving Our Own Bones, which is all about disability wisdom theology, talks a lot about human dignity throughout. It's not a central topic there, but it's really important. And then I would even say that, excuse me, hold on one second. Excuse me. I would even say that Emily Ladau, who is a Jewish disability rights activist, wrote an absolutely beautiful book. Again, not directly about human dignity, but the theme is woven throughout, and it's an incredible read called Demystifying Disability. And I put it in because I think that using that framework gets at really deep human questions. And the final text that I'll recommend for now, and if others arise, I will certainly send that on. Actually, two. One of them would be Rav Shai Held's latest Judaism is About Love, which is a tremendous work of Jewish theology. And I would also really commend my teacher, Rabbi David Jaffe's book, Changing the World from the Inside Out, which is about Musar and how we can use that as a way of living in accordance with our highest values.
Wonderful. Thank you. And for those of you who maybe didn't get a chance to write all that down, we'll try to include it in an email that we'll
Yeah,
send.
I will definitely write that up for
Yeah,
sure. I will definitely write that up.
I appreciate that. Yeah, so
Absolutely.
we'll send that to everyone. Um, some questions are starting to come in. So let me see here. It's a question here. It was noted that the rabbis did not seem to want to ruin one's good name and air issues in public. In the US, people can be accused of crimes, for example, abuse, and newspapers seem to publish at will. Then, even after one is found innocent, the damage is done. What would the rabbi say about that? Should the accused names not be published?
I actually think that the rabbis, like, I don't think that I can answer that question directly because every context is different. But I actually think so. There is a certain sense that the rabbis really believe in a shem tov as a general way of being in the world. And there are lots of different laws around lashon hara or negative speech, and like lots of different ways in which that plays out. Um, and I actually think that the rabbis would probably approach that question with a lot of sophistication, sensitivity, and nuance to think about how to move forward and what the proper procedures are. I don't think that there is a one size fits all answer to that. I think it would be very contextual. Certainly, if we go back to these texts that I'm talking about in Ta'anit, and there are lots of other places where the rabbis do this, the rabbis are very honest about their own and their colleagues' misjudgments. And I think that is significant. So I think that that is a piece that we can play a little bit with and invite ourselves into some questions around, but I don't think that there's a simple answer to that.
Thank you. Um, Another question here. Somebody noted that they once learned that baseless hatred was especially hardy because we can excuse ourselves by saying, my hatred is baseless. I have evidence. That's all in quotation marks. My hatred is baseless. Isn't baseless. I have evidence. And leave it.
Mm.
What do you think of that idea?
I absolutely think that human beings are very capable of doing that, right? Like we tell ourselves to kind of go back to the idea of the stories we tell, like we tell ourselves, well, the reason I have this particular hatred or this bias or whatever it is, I can give you all the reasons for it. And I think that that's a common mental action activity that we engage in, right? As a way, again, of perhaps defensiveness, defendedness, self-protection, all of those different things. But I think ultimately the rabbis are asking us to actually drop that, to let that go and to be like, we might engage there, but that doesn't mean that that's a proper way to actually be in the world. And ultimately, it's very self-perpetuating, right? Because we create these loops in our mind of like, well, I feel a particular way about a particular thing, and here are all the reasons. And be completely accurate in that. This is not about dropping our own sense of shlemut and integrity and yashrut. That's not about that at all. It's rather about recognizing the ways in which our own patterns perpetuate themselves to the point where we often can't find our way out of them. So I think that that's very common, and I think that we're being invited to examine that.
Yes, thank you. Next question here. Regarding the parable you discussed, I am struck by the fact that the dishonored man made his forgiveness conditional. Acting honorably with each other seems to me to be a two-way street. Don't all parties involved need to set their own egos aside, so to speak?
So I think that's a really important and really fair question, right? That it seems like this gentleman is saying, I will grant you the forgiveness on condition that that this doesn't happen again, right? And there's a certain world in which egos, I think, as part of a tshuva process, I think we do all have a role to play around introspection. And so I imagine a world in which if this story had had a longer timeline, maybe the the gentleman who's been so insulted would have had time to grapple, to process, to be with what has happened to him, right, in a real way. And then maybe down the line, Elazar could approach him and be like, "Oh my gosh, I really acted awful, like an awful way. Please forgive me." I think that in this text, because the forgiveness is asked for immediately after the incident, it can feel kind of like if you've ever been in a situation where something really upsetting has happened, and rather than people actually wanting to deal with it, they'd rather put it under the rug or like, let's make the peace, let's, pretend this never happened, the sense of kind of having to just ingest in a certain way what has actually happened without an honest reckoning. I think that's the key thing here is that what's missing is an honest reckoning. And so the forgiveness being asked for may feel less like forgiveness and a lot more like performativity of like, oh, well, this guy forgave me. So I guess what I did, even though it was terrible, is actually kind of okay. I can move forward rather than both parties being really honest about what happened. And rather than Elazar taking the steps that he needs to, as the Rambam later outlines in Hilchot Tshuva and the laws of repentance, the first of those is acknowledgement, as radical acknowledgement of what has happened. And that didn't happen in this telling. Now, of course, the Rambam, certainly didn't come about until about 700 years after the Talmud was compiled. But like this particular text, I think, doesn't give room for that kind of honest introspection, which may have resulted in softening by the gentleman who's been insulted.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions here on the structures of the Jewish community and Jewish life, and asking like what changes do we need to make now to stimulate the process of change for the better, uh,
Mm,
in Jewish communal life or any structures in particular.
yeah, that's a really such an important question. I fundamentally believe that we do this work of change when we are in trusting relationship. And my personal feeling on it, in my own experience and the experience of others that I've been in relationship with in this way, is that that kind of work happens in smaller, intimate spaces that then ripple outward, right? So if I could create the kind of communal infrastructure that I think can really get us there, one thing I would really emphasize is helping us create spaces that are small and intimate and where people know one another and where there's trust, there's a notion in some of the circles that I'm in that you have to move at the speed of trust. Because when you move at the speed of trust, that's what allows for vulnerability. That's what allows for relationship. We're not going to do this by hearing, you know, um, a broad-based, you know, gathering with thousands of people. It really, I believe, happens in simultaneous, small, intentional spaces. And I think it starts from the top, but I also believe it starts from the bottom simultaneously. That actually, not only do our communal leaders, whether they're rabbis or heads of lots of organizations or whatever that is, when there's a role there for sure, and that role is going to be very different based on the kind of person you are and the kind of rabbinate you have or the kind of leadership you have or whatever that is. And of course, cantors and all kinds of other clergy are part of that. But I think it also really begins at the bottom that we as Jews, regardless of whether we're rabbis or not, or whoever we are, we have this tradition is our inheritance. It belongs to all of us. And so, because it belongs to all of us, that's both an incredible privilege and a tremendous responsibility because we, in our own little circles of influence, in our families, in our friendship groups, in our shuls, if we're part of a shul, like whatever that is, we can find 3 to 5 people who we have that trusting relationship with. We can sit down and have these conversations and have these you know really difficult questions surface. And I think the more we encourage that, I think the better off we will be broadly. We begin, I know those conversations are already happening all over the community, and we're not hearing so much about them, but they're very alive. They're happening all the time. If that became the mode, rather than, as somebody said to me this past Shabbat, we have moved from a world of broadcast to a world of narrowcast, right? Where we will often say what our views are or, write a particular article, but ultimately that gets read mostly by people who already agree. So we have to fundamentally shift how we are relating and how do we bring people in so that we can have that new, resilient moral fiber that I believe we are deeply capable of. We just have to work on it all together.
Thank you. Yes, that relates directly to another one of the questions, which was asking about the role of social media in like either
Mm.
deepening or healing Sinat Hinam today. If there's anything further you want to say about that.
Say totally transparently that I made the decision many months ago to personally leave social media. So I want to name that. So I haven't been really in the thick of it. But of course, you can't live in the world, even if you yourself were not spending a lot of time on social media. You can't live in a hermetically sealed universe, right? Like we're all impacted by social media. Um, One of the reasons that I consciously chose to no longer personally be on social media is because I think that social media is a really good example of what I was describing of self-perpetuation, right? That is the entire point of these algorithms. These algorithms give you what you give them. It's a very simple formula. The more you put in, the more you get out, right? So ideally, if you're going to use that tool for really good things, which I believe is possible, there's a lot of good out there. There's a lot of good wisdom that's shared on social media, like lots of different kind of thinkers and rabbis and all of that. If you want to spend your time like really in those spaces, that's totally possible and you'll get more of that. But the app also um, rewards certain kind of remote emotional reactivity. It's almost incentivized, right? And I don't want to sound like a facile person when I talk about this. I'm talking about this from my own deep experience of social media. It's very easy if you've ever just pause. The next time, if you are a social media user, I want to invite you to pause. Notice what's happening in your mind the longer you're on social media. Like, notice the quality of what's going on internally, the more of that content you receive. And I think, like, I am not someone who says, well, we've got to get rid of social media. Social media is so baked in we have the ability to, though, to think about how we use it. And I think we also, and this is a skill set that I think is really important to develop, I think it's helpful for us to think about how we mindfully engage with it, how we approach it as a tool and not as an or a means to an end in any way. So that I think is really important. And I will say also really important on that point, one of the other reasons that I am no longer part of social media, personally on social media, is because in my experience, and I imagine that I am not alone in this, social media is an incredibly easy vehicle to use to dehumanize because we kind of trick ourselves, right? Social media can kind of trick us into thinking we know a lot more than we do, right? And if you are a person, as I know many of us are, as I certainly have this tendency within myself too, so I'm very much in this work of finding a lot of finding it easy to go into a place of deep self-righteousness, like my views are clearly correct and I am on the morally correct side. I could just completely have that fed to me over and over again. Social media doesn't usually allow for a lot of challenge and nuance and deep intellectual thinking. It actually, I think, privileges really facile, really simple ways of thinking, which I think, generally speaking, are not wise and skillful. So that would be my particular view on that, for what it's worth.
Thank you. Yes, I can definitely see how the algorithm will, whether it's cat videos or something political, it definitely just gives you what you want to hear over and over again. So,
Exactly. Exactly.
um, a question here: can you give advice on how to handle keeping our Yetzer raw when it comes to those who are so awful to us, such as anti-Semites? Um,
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. I'm really glad it was asked. So, something that I would love to see in the Jewish world broadly is more skillfulness around that exact question, right? Of like, how do we, I think about this also. I'll use ableism as an example of this because this is something I think quite a bit about, right? I, if I were to, which I could do, go online and every day find every awful thing that was ever said about a disabled person, I wouldn't be functional because you can go into places that are so awful and wretched to know the deep underbelly of the human spirit and the human soul is really despairing, right? It's gut punching, right? And so one of the things that I had to learn a long time ago is to be very, very intentional with what kind of media I consume, not as a bypass. And I use that word a lot. What I mean by that is not as an avoidance technique, but as a way of remaining in touch with my basic holiness and goodness as a human being created in the image of God. So something that I think is really crucial, and I say this with incredible sorrow, it's not something that I take any joy in saying. Unfortunately, in the world as we are, there are always going to be people with deeply ingrained anti-Jewish animus and anti-Semitic bias. That's going to be with us. And the question that we have to sit with is that's present. I desperately wish that it wasn't. I desperately wish that ableism was a thing of the past. I desperately wish that sexism, misogyny, homophobia, all of those things, I wish all of those things, racism, all of them, I wish every bit of them were non-existent in the world. I wish human beings did not harbor that kind of base prejudice. And unfortunately, most of us, in some way, have some kind of unexamined bias that we are carrying. And online environments are often really easy to express that. So the question is, what are the things we can skillfully do? One of the things that I try in my own practice is pausing, really getting grounded in like, oh, I read something the other day that felt really upsetting to me. And I remember like that feeling immediately of constriction, like, oh, like that kind of like gut punch of like, I can't believe that this is a thing, right? And I had to get up, walk away, pause, really get grounded and like, oh, that really hurt. That was really painful. That thing that I read was really painful. No, like I wish that wasn't there. And then when I'm able to get grounded in that and to be like, oh, that was really hard. And I can give myself a little bit of space. That's the other thing. Our culture right now incentivizes immediate reactive response. And if we can give ourselves a little bit of space to be like, that was really painful. Do I actually need to engage with that? There are times when the answer is absolutely yes, right? This is not about, just ignoring things at all. That is not what I'm suggesting. Quite the opposite. It's about how do we skillfully engage and how do we ensure that all of our intention. I mean, I wish that this was not a conversation that we had to honestly have, right? I wish that these things didn't exist in the world, but because we are what we are and they do exist as they do, we have to figure out how do we simultaneously know when to wisely respond and how do we simultaneously know when to put our attention on all of the things that make us who we are, right? Because sometimes I think what happens in my own experience is that when I get so triggered by other people's animus towards me, I forget who I am, right? It's almost like a disorientation of like, I forget who I am at my core. And that's, I think, a key thing to remind ourselves who are we? Who are we at our core? And to be grounded there so that when we have to engage with other people's animus, we can do so in ways that are skillful and in ways that are unapologetic, right? That are like, that's not okay. There's a lot of stuff out there that's not okay. And I think that that's important to remind people of. Like, there is all kinds of, ways of being with other people that are harmful. And let's not forget that. So, that I think is a way forward in some ways.
Wonderful. Thank you. And um, it sounds like your process is a lot of mindfulness and awareness.
Yes.
And another question here, which maybe you feel like you've already spoken to entirely, but they're asking the question is, can you speak to the more nuanced ways that people spiritually bypass that they may not even be aware of? So maybe people who aren't bringing as much mindfulness to to how they live in the world.
Yeah, so I want to actually, I'm glad you named that, Matt, because I want to frame, which I didn't say up front. You might have noticed it in my talk. Mindfulness practice is a core part of my practice. Am a meditation practitioner, and I read meditation a lot. So like, this is a really core piece of how I think about myself, in the Jewish world. Of course, contemplative practice is very deeply Jewish, and unfortunately, we are just now kind of rediscovering that. But anyway, that's a sidebar to just kind of frame a little bit of like why I orient that way. So, in terms of the bypass, right, which is something that happens in all kinds of ways, not only in terms like we talk about it a lot in mindfulness spaces and meditation spaces because any kind of tool can be used as a bypass, right? You can choose to engage in all kinds of avoidance or to claim that like things aren't as they are. So I think one way that we humans do that, that we bypass without even realizing we're bypassing, think about if you've ever been in a situation where we kind of use, like, people can use practices without really engaging. Like, for example, I'm trying to think of a way to sort of make this a little bit broader. I'll use the example to the question that I just answered, right? Let's say, for example, that read that really frustratingly upsetting thing, right? And if I just go into that place of denial, like, oh, there are always going to be people like that, just let it go. Maybe they didn't mean it the way they said it, da da da. Maybe it wasn't so bad. Like, there are ways in which that can turn into an avoidance of like me not getting in touch with how I'm actually feeling, right? It's like what the PSS and the Rabbi talks about in terms of opening to the emotional experience. He has this really beautiful text around, something arises in our emotional field, but we don't know what to do with it. So rather than dealing with it, we start distracting ourselves, right? And he uses all kinds of examples of like what a distraction is. So part of it is building in, and I'm not saying like every time you read something upsetting, you need to spend like an hour dealing with it. I'm saying like take 30 seconds and just kind of note like, wow, that really hurt, right? And that then gives more agency in how to respond. Because I think a lot of times when we show up in the world, a lot of it is rooted in feeling so deeply unacknowledged. And part of that is we have to learn how to acknowledge ourselves. And I mean that individually as well as in community. And I mean that in terms of acknowledging all that we're holding, because that's another piece of this is that I think it's often really hard for people to, we create often spaces where people don't feel like they can be truly honest with what their soul is yearning for, what they really are holding, what their heartbreak is, because we're afraid of people's reaction. So part of it is we need to really work on working with our own reactivity and knowing how to be grounded. And when we notice that reactivity, knowing that we have actually, internally and externally, we have more agency around how we respond. And often, in my experience, when we take that time to not bypass the pain, but to actually be with it in a way that's manageable, and there are lots of different skills that people can kind of use as a way of doing that, right? If we can figure out how to do that, then we are able to then respond with more wisdom and ultimately, the wiser the response that is not afraid of acknowledging the hurt or whatever it is that arose, generally the better the outcome, right? We're going to get ultimately the outcome that we might, let me say that differently, we might have a better shot at the outcome that we are hoping for. We might not, and that's also true. And then we have to be with that, and that's a whole other separate thing. But we are in a world of such fracturing relationships that, with so many unmet needs and longings and feelings of betrayal, that I think the more we can become intimate with our own experience, the better we are able to be in relationship with other people.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions here, at least, and you can let me know if you want to skip them, but I'll bring them up. And they're both about the current world situation today, particularly in Israel. And one person is asking about the source 5 that you noted, Talmud Bavli, Shabbat, and whether it applies to Jews today who do not protest the dire conditions in Gaza. And then a second one, this person notes that the elephant in the room as they started. How can we as Jews, especially those trying to live a holy life, reconcile the fact that the Israeli leadership seems to be practitioners of Sinat Chinam right now, with the need to defend our right as a people to survive and be treated with honor and dignity by the broader world? Um,
Yeah, no, I think I will take those in brief.
okay.
Um, I think about these questions a lot in my own work and my own soul, my own practice. These are very live for me. And I believe that the Torah does command or does invite or does really obligate even us to engage in the kind of action that we feel morally compelled. I know I have been engaging in that kind of action to the degree that I am able to. And I would really encourage, thinking about that source from Shabbat, I would really deeply encourage that kind of action and reflection. Because as the rabbis teach also, right, there's a notion of study and there's a notion of action, right? And we have to do both of those things. And I think it's I think it's extremely imperative, right? And I think that figuring out, and again, this is where Hashbon and Nefesh really plays into this. This is where that radical soul accounting that I was talking about really makes a difference because in the work that I've done in my own moral introspection and my own action taking, I'm trying to get really clear, and I have my own particular views. I'm trying to get really, really clear about where and this also comes from my community organizing background, where do I have power and influence as a citizen? Where do I have power and influence as a rabbi? I think about those questions a lot. And how do I use that or leverage it? And how do I frame it in the deep Jewish values that I try to live my life by to ensure that our tradition is actually living up to that instead of we're at this moment of profound collapse morally. And I think it's important for us to grapple with that and to figure out what does that mean for each of us? And I really, really want to encourage. I think that that text is as relevant now as it's ever been. I really want to encourage folks to dig deep inside and figure out where and how we can act as agents in the world for a better world, for a just world, for an abundant world. I think that's key. And in terms of the second question, so I very much believe that it is that our tradition really commands us to never forget our moral compass. And I'm deeply, deeply sad that a lot of people in our world today seem to have forgotten that moral compass. So if you never forget that compass that guides you, may that compass guide you towards the morally right action that you need to do in this moment. And I will also say in relation to that, that with regards to how different actors in the world, whether it's governments, whether it's different citizens, like all of these things, how do we live a life of holiness and honor? And how do we do that in relationship to what's arising when there's a lot of incredibly bad behavior and maliciousness? And like, I could use all kinds of words. I'm not going to get too far into that for our purposes today. But again, it really goes back to remembering who you are and remembering your moral goodness, to not get disoriented by the moral collapse that we see in lots of ways in the world, in lots of different ways. And how do our hearts hold multiplicity, even as we feel deeply, perhaps grounded in our own moral sensibilities? It is possible, and this is what our tradition trains us for. This is what the Talmud is really good at. It's not about relativism. We are not a morally relativistic tradition. We are a tradition that demands better of us than that and demands us to say we can hold multiple things at once, that we can actually train ourselves to be able to hold and respond to multiple realities on the ground at once. And we can do that. And the more we can do that, I think the stronger and the more grounded we are. And that's the kind of moral leadership I know that I am leading, trying to lead by. And that's the moral leadership that I am seeking. So I hope that that is, and I'm happy to I'll leave it there for our purposes, but I know, and I'm carrying all of these questions very much in the forefront of my soul right now.
Thank you. Yes, and we appreciate you hearing your thoughts, and I just want to make it clear that we're not, I read a couple of questions, but we're not implicating anybody in anything in particular when it comes to all the political things. But the reality is that that's an example of how different people have to reconcile and experience the world today. So I don't think we need to go down that route any further. Well, with the time that we have left, I want to give you an opportunity to leave us with any final thoughts about how we can to live out this ethic of human dignity and anything else you would like to share with us.
I want to again thank you all for having me at this extraordinarily difficult moment. And as we are navigating this extremely upsetting, challenging, heartbreaking time, part of what we can never forget, and the practice begins with our own spheres of influence, wherever those are, to remember at the end of the day that every single person is created in the image of God. And that if we forget that, really nothing else matters at the end. And too many of us in the world forget that all the time, which leads us down extremely dangerous paths. And I want to urge us to return to that basic religious aspirational teaching that we are fundamentally each and every human life is fundamentally and irreplaceably sacred. How would we be with each other if we remembered that? If we not only remembered that, but actively lived that way. It's really hard to do because we are so conditioned by larger society not to, but we can choose to be countercultural and we can choose to act in that alignment and do everything we possibly can do to lift up that core teaching that we are all inherently and irreplaceably valuable. And the more we speak with that singular voice, the more we live that out in how we teach and how we lead and how we live, the more we can move towards building a world in which we can all thrive and flourish.
Thank you. That's just a beautiful and wonderful way to end this session. And so thank you again for sharing your wisdom with us. Um, I haven't read all of the many thank yous and many notes of inspiration and about your teachings and such. There's so many notes that people have sent in during your presentation and during the Q&A. So thank you. And I know our audience truly appreciates all that you shared with us this afternoon. So.
Yeah, thank you again so much for having me. I feel really grateful for the opportunity to teach and share in this way, and I really hope that folks will take a lot of this to heart in deep ways as we move through this time.